Welcome to another edition of Patriot Network TV. It's Ash Wednesday. It's a great, beautiful day in the greatest place on earth, beautiful Prescott AZ. What are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk about Phil Jones, Dr. Phil Jones, from the Hadley Climate Research Unit of the East Anglia University in Great Britain. Dr. Jones admitted in a rather stunning interview that many of the things that they have claimed, and by they I mean the global warming alarmists, the anthropogenic global warming crowd, many of the things that they have held up as true, oh gosh, I guess they're not really true. And between ClimateGate, GlacierGate, NOAAGate, and all of the other gates, including HollandGate, all of the various gates showing that the IPCC is just like the rest of the United Nations, just a political organization. It's not a scientific organization. They've had to admit to a bunch of things, but I wanted to go through these one at a time. Dr. Jones admitted, and this is at the heart of the whole IPCC global warming scare, the global warming scam, the great global warming swindle. At the heart of it was that the 20th century was warmer than any other period because of CO2. And if you boil the anthropogenic global warming argument down to its basis, they said CO2 causes the temperature to go up. CO2 causes an increase in global mean temperature. Well, that could only be true if they got rid of the global, they got rid of other events like the medieval warm period and the Holocene maximum. Now, one of the arguments that had been made by the global warming alarmists was there was no medieval warm period, there was no Holocene maximum. Phil Jones has had to admit, and he has this week in an interview, that yes, the medieval warm period did exist and it was warmer then than it is now. Now, that admission in and of itself is earth-shattering for the anthropogenic global warming crowd, because the heart of their argument was that the release of CO2 by burning of fossil fuels had caused an uncontrollable increase in the warmth of the planet, and we were on a path to destruction. To admit that naturally caused events, naturally occurring events, 5,000, 8,000, 1,000 years ago, in the medieval warm period, in the Holocene maximum, those naturally occurring events were 3 to 5 degrees warmer than it is today. That shows that the entirety of the global warming farrago, this giant mishmash of all kinds of environmental doom and gloom, is basically false. Next admission. From 1995 to 2010, there has been no statistically significant global warming. Global mean temperature has not changed from 1995 to 2010. For 15 years, according, and by the way, I had already told you this because Richard Lindzen had published this in the peer-reviewed literature, that from 1995 to the present there has been no statistically significant change in temperature, and during that same period of time, CO2 emissions have gone up by 26%. Now, in terms of a hypothesis test, if your hypothesis is CO2 causes temperature to go up, if we increase CO2 by 26% and temperature stays the same, we can reject that hypothesis. In other words, CO2 is not causing, at least for the last 15 years, CO2 is not causing global mean temperature to go up. Not only that, Dr. Jones admits, as Richard Lindzen, the Alfred Sloan Professor of Atmospheric Physics and Meteorology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, as he had already said, from 2002 to 2010, global mean temperature has been going down. So CO2 emissions up, global mean temperature down. How does that reconcile itself to the whole of the global warming alarmist argument? It disproves it. It shows that they are wrong. They are wrong in terms of their core theory. They're wrong in terms of their models. Now, ClimateGate, which was the exposing, and we still don't know whether this was done internally by a whistleblower at East Anglia or whether they were hacked by the Russians. The Russians, because they have lots of oil and they want to sell it and they don't want any restrictions on it, have a natural reason to be involved in this. But the Russians also have made public that their data records of especially the Siberian stations doesn't conform to what was published by Phil Jones and his compatriots at the Hadley Climate Research Unit, their data shows a much warmer world than the Russian data, which means that the data that Phil Jones admits, well, we just lost the data. We show you global warming, but the dog ate our homework, basically. The data that they lost was the data from the stations in Siberia, that if that colder data was kept in, it would have brought down global mean temperature, and it would not have shown the increase that was broadcast as the harbinger of the doom of mankind. So Phil Jones has had to admit, 1995-2010, no statistically significant increase in warming. 2002 to 2010, global mean temperature down. During that same period of time, CO2 emissions up by 26%. What does that mean about the core of their theory? CO2 increases cause temperature increases. It rejects that hypothesis. They are bankrupt. There is no more. Now, over at the United Nations, we find out that the IPCC is wrong, wrong, wrong. ClimateGate affects them in that they, hook, line, and sinker, published their models based on the false data, the data that had been falsified, or tricked, or fixed, or adjusted to hide the decline. I'm quoting Dr. Jones in the emails. He said, we have to find a way to hide the decline. We have to find, it's an outrage that our models don't correctly predict what's going on, and we have to hide the decline. It turns out that the head of the IPCC, unbeknownst to most people, is not a climatologist. He has a degree in engineering. He is a railroad engineer. It further turns out that they have pretty much everything wrong. The Indian and the head of the IPCC is a scientist, is a railroad engineer from India. It turns out that the whole glacier gate, all the glaciers in India and China are going to melt and it's going to destroy the watershed. Well, it turns out that was not based on peer-reviewed research. It was not based on anything except an article in a magazine that deals with mountain climbing, and then an unpublished dissertation by a doctoral student who was a global warming alarmist. So they had to backtrack and say there's no proof, no evidence, no proof, no statistical model, nothing, that the glaciers will all evaporate by 2035. We have nothing in place, and even worse, the scientist that they pointed to and said, this is the guy who said this, came out and said, A, I never said it, and B, the evidence is exactly the opposite. So GlacierGate, ClimateGate, and what else? NOAAGate. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration was put through an audit by Anthony Watts and his computer expert, and they found out that most, not some, not selected, most of NOAA's data on temperature is incorrect. Now, many of the global warming alarmists claimed that 1998 was the warmest year in the 20th century. When McKittrick and McIntyre went back and looked at the GIS, the Goddard Institute for Space Studies, when they looked at the GIS data from Dr. Hansen, they found out that 1934 was, not 1998. So I'm going to do one more this week. I'm going to do the second part of this episode on this and how it relates to the new budget and the looming debt crisis we have, and how the good news is we don't have to do cap and trade. We don't have to do any of this expensive stuff that costs us energy and costs us jobs, because the science is in fact incorrect. So I'll be back in a minute and we'll do more in part 2 of the end of anthropogenic global warming.